Welcome, 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 welcome. One more welcome for everybody, just one, not two. Thank you for joining us, part of our continuing series where we talk to people on the left, people on the right, professors, academics, reporters, activists, politicians, anybody who can think clearly and provide a unique perspective. We want to provide it to you unedited and unaltered so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With this, today it's our privilege to have Professor David Dunning. He's at the Psychology School at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on psychology underlying human misbelief. In his most widely cited work, he showed that people tend to hold flattering opinions of their competence, character, and prospects that cannot be justified from objective evidence, a phenomenon that carries many implications for health, education, the workplace, and economic exchange. He also examines how many of these same processes also injure judgments made by groups. Dunning's other research focuses on decision-making in various settings. In work on economic gains, he explores how choices commonly presumed to be economic in nature actually hinge more on psychological factors, such as social norms and emotion. In particular, he documents that people trust complete strangers in situations in which the economic analysis would suggest no trust whatsoever. Finally, Dunning explores how people's preferences and wishes distort their own judgments and conclusions. In past work, he has shown how the influence of motivated reasoning extends even down to shape perceptual experience such as vision and hearing. He's been at the University of Michigan. He's also at Cornell University, and he was also taught a little bit at Yale University and the Sonder Volkshochschule University and Institutes for Wirtschaft. He was also at Stanford University, so a lot of great universities, and he's taught a lot of different places. Some of the grants that he's worked on: investigating motivated reasoning and intellectual humility, epistemic trespassing and public discourse, cognitive habits of intellectual humility, the gist of hot and cold cognition in adolescent risk-taking, motivated reasoning, identifying experience and ignorance in self and others, accuracy and error, self-judgment, self-esteem, and social judgment. Judgment biases in perception, self-cognition, where does intellectual humility reside, the trouble of not knowing what you do not know, and an introduction to reason, bias, and inquiry. And this was the series where I found the professor, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's check in first. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything about your bio at all?
Not that I know of.
Okay, great. Awesome. We love that here. Well, let's get into it then. There was this series on political polarization. It had a variety of speakers. The U.S. is experiencing unprecedented levels of political polarization relative to the past decades, especially in terms of effective polarization, something we've talked about a lot here at the series, or feelings of dislike and distrust toward members of the opposing party. In this Winter Talk series, we will hear from experts across disciplines in order to better understand why political polarization is so high and what, if anything, we can do about it. And here's a little bit close up on that series, the University of Michigan. Why was this series done? Why did you participate in it? Why did people think it was a good idea? I'll ask you about what you said as maybe the reasonings for political polarization and the solutions. But first, I want to get into why was this series? Why were people coming together? Why did you think this was a good idea? And before you answer, if you could answer as an American with two working eyeballs, not just an academic, and explain it to me as if I've been in a cave for the last 7 years. What's going on? Why did they have a class at a university? Why was this worth having multiple professors come out?
Well, if you've been in the cave for the past 7 years, well, for much longer than the past 7 years, the Research Center for Group Dynamics at the University of Michigan has been having seminars on the issues of the day. And this was a series that was put together by my colleague, Amy Gordon, because it's clear for the past 20 years, you could say for the past 50 years, the nature of political disagreement in the United States has been changing from disagreement over issues, policy, to disagreement over each other. And it's taken an emotional cast. For example, very, very few parents would have been minded if their children would have married someone from the opposite political party, let's say the 1960s, but now a third let's say Democrats, and a third of Republicans would mind it very much if their children married someone from the opposite political party now. And I'm actually not sure in 2023 if that percentage has risen. We've become we oppose each other as oppose each other on issues, and there is emotion we attach to it, and sometimes the emotion can be quite negative. The emotion can be quite strong. That's the affective polarization that's often mentioned. You've just mentioned it. That's why this series was brought together to talk about it, because the University of Michigan is one of the centers in the world in talking about social trends, social phenomena, and what do we think and what do we do. So that's why it was brought together.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know it's a little bit silly of a question, but it helps with the series, because what I'm trying to do is capture what you're seeing, not what I think is going on. But so I always ask people, like, if you were explaining to somebody who didn't know, how would you characterize it? Because occasionally we'll get a professor, 2 out of the last 100, who will say, there's not a big problem. Everything's fine. It's a little bit overblown. So I like talking to people who go, no, there's a real issue here going on. Some people are quite upset. Affective polarization. That's just dislike of the other side because they're the other. That's my simplification of it. One of the debates that I've seen in this space is the people aren't polarized. It's just the elites. It's just the elites are polarized. The people actually agree with each other on, they want safe places for schools, and they want background checks on guns, and they want women to have rights to abortion. So really, there's no polarization amongst the people. It's just amongst the elites. Is that true in your opinion?
Well, you could make that case, actually, that if you take a look at where clearly the most debate happens, it is among the elites. But if that's the case, the elites used to disagree with each other mostly on policy, and now the elites have divided themselves into ideological sides. But actually, if you take a look at data, what you're finding is among the non-elite. It used to be the case that people's attitudes, a lot of different policies, basically were just sort of random or mishmash, were a mess. People agreed, but they weren't ideological. But that's beginning to shift. People's beliefs are beginning to become more uniform. There's always been a small cadre of the elites where people were more purely conservative or more purely liberal, but that's becoming more of the case all the way up and down the educational or the elite or non-elite ladder, for example. And if it's the case that people might agree on what they want, if you ask them about individual policies, the way they vote seems to be much more polarized, if you will. There isn't that much shifting from election to election in the way that people are voting. They're voting much more consistently Republican or Democratic. And now there are some political scientists who will say things are different. But from the data I've seen and what I've read, it does seem that there are voters are much more consistent in terms of, quote unquote, which side on the partisan divide they vote for than was the case in the past.
I appreciate that. It's a long-running debate. It's one that I've struggled with here. I think you had Professors Abramowitz versus Professors Fiorina and others who were having this long-running debate of, it's just the elites who are polarized. It's not the public. The public loves each other. They basically all agree on abortion policy, but for some reason we can't make it happen. It's just the elites.
Well, the answer is it's all true. It's the way you look at it. But the question is, okay, which way do you look at it counts? I think it's ultimately what you have to do. And I try to look at it in the way of, okay, which way represents how elections come out. And
right.
That's my way of looking at it. But often what you find is each side is right if you look at it this way or if you cut the data that way.
I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, but I'm taking a look at, we don't have Ronald Reagan landslides anymore. We don't have Lyndon Johnson landslides anymore. We have 52-48 elections.
Thank you.
And things don't shift all that much. Things are different now. And so that to me is the thing that defines our era. Why are people so solidly in the voting pattern that they're in? That's my take.
That's the thing for me is like, I hear, oh, the people aren't polarized. It's just the elites. We don't need to bag on or insult the people. It's the elites, the politicians, the media, social media companies make them this way. And then I hear statistics like, yeah, but they don't want to marry each other.
Yeah.
That sounds like the people.
That's different.
Right. I understand it's not an issue stance, but that does sound polarized. And like you said, if the people want all the same thing, why do they keep voting for polarized policy year after year after year after year? And then we constantly hear, well, the people have a commonality on abortion and guns and everything. Okay, but they haven't voted that way in 2 decades. So what's the point?
And remember, the debate is also to what extent are people giving weight to their feelings about their political party versus the other side versus they're giving weight to policy.
Right.
And I'm not going to speak on that because I haven't looked at, okay, what's the 2023 data in terms of how much are people voting on policy versus the other side. But you can have people agree on policy and still think the other side is a mortal danger to the United States. And there is a plurality of both parties that think that of the other side, according to Pew Research Center. All that can be true. Now the question is, which endorsement by voters is carrying their vote, or do neither count? It's just that people have a behavioral inertia to vote for the party that they voted for in the last 3 elections. I mean, those are the data I don't know, but those are the data that count, and I'd love to find out what the latest analysis is.
I think this is an excellent, excellent, excellent point. You can still have people agree on policy and still hate each other and think the other side's a bad guy. I mean, that just seems crazy to me. Like, we both agree that an apple is the best fruit, not an orange, but I still hate you. Even though you would think, because we like typically in psychology, right? If I like the same thing that you do, you feel a commonality to me, or some sort of friendship, not necessarily feelings of enemy. And it doesn't seem to matter here. St. Paul.
Well, I'm a social psychologist, and the fact that people can hold beliefs that at some level seem contradictory is not a surprise.
Okay. This is common with humans.
Well, this is what being human is, where we contain multitudes. We are filled with contradictions. And here's the biggest contradiction. Humans are very concerned about being consistent and coherent. We are very concerned about that. That's what cognitive dissonance is, number one. Number two, we're filled with contradictions. These two things actually coexist within us is one of the greatest conversations we have in social psychology. How could we be filled with contradictions? And yet it is absolutely the case. Human beings are very much worried about being coherent. It's fascinating.
Worried about being coherent, inherently full of contradictions beyond what maybe we're even consciously aware of.
Oh, absolutely. As soon as you make it coherent, people do, or make it conscious, people do try to explain it away. But people are incredibly adept at not being aware of their contradictions in the world or contradictions in themselves.
I don't know. All my English Shakespeare classes in high school are coming back to me. This just screams the human character condition, what the contradictions in the human character, right? We want to be understood, and yet we don't have coherent opinions ourselves. We're not totally aware of it, but we're always trying to be understood. And we think we probably do have completely coherent ideologies, but we don't when you get into it. That's, like you said, the human condition.
Oh, yes. The answer is yes, Shakespeare was an excellent theorist.
Let me ask you about this. used to be people's opinions on policies were all across the board. Now their beliefs are becoming more uniform across issues. Now, I'm not asking you to say like as a basis of fact, but as somebody who's worked in academics and as an American with two working eyeballs and working synapses, when did you notice that start to shift? Kind of a personal story. Would you have like,
Well,
that's different?
I would have to, for me, I think it would be about 6 months ago when I started looking at some political science papers that have been looking at this. That is the classic series of papers, or the classic book for me in political science, which is not my specialty, but that I refer to quite a bit, I think about quite a bit, is work by Phil Converse, published in the 1960s,
Right.
called Public Opinion in Mass Publics, or I forget. But it has to do with how incoherent people's attitudes and opinions tend to be. That if you come and you interview a person in 1959 and come back and interview them in 1961, it's as though for the average person, they're picking their attitudes about the policies of the day out of thin air. It's just completely random, except for, as you mentioned before, the elites, and it's a small portion of the elites who are completely consistent. And as you go down the education ladder, things become less coherent. That for most people, things aren't really well thought out. That was Phil Converse's world, and that absolutely is so. So it resonates with what some of your guests must be saying. Now, in data starting, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or so, that is still evident if you take a look at high versus lower education. But as time has gone on, everybody is becoming more coherent in terms of their beliefs beginning to cohere together, becoming more consistent. That is, in Phil Converse's day, there wasn't much of something called issue or ideological constraint. What I believed about government funding of education didn't correlate with whether I thought there should be a Department of Education.
Right.
It should, but it didn't. Now things are beginning to cohere, and much more. In fact, they're beginning to cohere so that if I think of myself as a liberal or a conservative, it actually is beginning to influence whether or not I consider myself as white or black, religious or not religious. So it's being
right. I read that the political differences now, according to some, everyone agrees, but there's not just one. There's a couple people who've done this, and they're saying, going, political differences are worse than race differences today. I mean, I guess that's progress.
Well, when political differences are predict whether or not you take COVID vaccines,
right?
That's like a number one predictor. That's an amazing state of the world. But now attitudes are beginning to cohere around that centroid, if you will. And that's different, and that's been developing, I think, for the past 20 years. So don't quote me on that. I'm going to have to review that because I'm going to be lecturing on that next week in my class. I am going to be lecturing on that because we're talking about cognitive dissonance and coherence belief. But I've just been monitoring this because in psychology, there's work about how much our beliefs and our attitudes cohere, and if you can persuade a person on belief X, can you influence their belief Y, which is related.
Right.
And sometimes you can, but there is also a lot of just randomness in the head. But there seems to be less randomness in the head going on politically with people up and down the elite scale. And that's different from Phil Converse's day. And that's fascinating.
When do you think that started?
I think that started in the 90s. And I think and I think it's my take, and this is not scientific, this is just speculation on my part. That starts with the internet, and now we're being just inundated with information. and we're being inundated with information regardless of education level now. You don't have to pick up a book. You don't have to take a class. You're just online now. And people are making it's easier for outside agents to communicate to you. And they're making sure that they do so.
Professor, many newspapers and politicians have said political polarization never existed before we had social media. It's these social media apps that made us polarized, and things were, they alone caused the problem. And if we could just get rid of Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff, we go back to a past without political polarization. Does that make sense to you?
I don't know. I'm agnostic on that. Because I think mid 20th century, both parties were centrist parties, but pre the Depression, I wouldn't be surprised if we were polarized then as well.
Interesting.
You should ask a historian, because the politics of the 20th century were pretty, from the New Deal on, were pretty strange. If you think about the New Deal coalition, it was the South and Northeastern urban liberals put together. And that wasn't the coalitions that were in play before the Depression. So there may have been a polarization beforehand, but I'm not a historian, so I don't know. That's the question that I've always had.
Fair enough. So I've heard that from a few professors that they said the period from 1945 to 1985 was bizarre and unique. It was a period of great commonality and everyone coming together mostly. And it was unique in American history because you had the Civil War, you had the period after 1870s, you had the 1920s, you had the 1930s, you had all these other periods of ups and downs. So maybe it's not so bizarre looking at grand American history. It's just bizarre to us now because we've had such an abnormally long period of everyone roughly getting along that we kind of tricked ourselves into thinking this is the way it's always supposed to be, when that was never the truth. There was periods of high polarization, periods of less polarization, periods of high. And so we're just going back into that. But we wouldn't know it because we're looking at an arc of 200 years, and our human experience only goes the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. And I don't know. It's just that during 45 to 85 was certainly us versus the Soviet Union. And there's something to bring people together than some third party, Right. If you have a common enemy that brings people together, I wouldn't be surprised. That was an unusual period of history.
A great existential threat. Okay, so allows people to come together. I did find this interesting. Elite polarization differences maybe started in the 1990s. A lot of people are saying that. They're saying that roughly looks like when things started. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So I found that interesting. And that was my answer, is if polarization started in the 1990s, but social media didn't become a real force in politics till around 2014, 2015, then what was causing polarization before? Well, we did have the internet. And the first highly polarizing event of the 1990s was the Monica Lewinsky trial or affair. And that got started because of a blog site called the Drudge Report. CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS didn't really want to cover the Monica Lewinsky scandal and weren't really doing that. Then the Drudge Report kept talking about it, generated so much traffic, it forced all the major networks to cover it, and then they were doing it. So we never were going to have that if we didn't have the Drudge Report. The Drudge Report was definitely a beast from the internet, and it existed 10 to 15 years before social media. So that's, I agree with you. That's where I'm going. It starts somewhere in the 1990s, and the internet, if not the cause, was a big part.
Well, it was. I think the internet is an accelerant, and I think it's because it doesn't create more voices, but if you have a voice, it allows voices to get to more people more quickly. a bigger reach, if you will, or makes the voice louder. I think that's certainly what happens. I mean, I opened my email. The number of people asking for money.
Okay, so let me ask you what the series asked. Why is political polarization so high, and what can we do about it?
It's a interesting question. Mostly it had to, like you said, a lot of it had to do with whether or not there really is political polarization. So there was some talk about is there really selectivity in terms of who's watching Fox versus MSNBC, for example. And it depends on how you cut it up. But there are millions of liberals who watch Fox. There are millions of conservatives who do watch MSNBC. That certainly is true. That's one way you can take a look at it. If you take a look at who lives in what neighborhood, many more people are living in landslide neighborhoods. That is a greater people's neighborhoods tend to be more uniform in terms of who they vote for, either a liberal neighborhood or conservative neighborhood, where neighborhoods tend to be 50-50s. Your neighbors tend to be more, members of the opposition party, and now they tend to be more of a liberal party. I certainly live in a landslide city. I live in Ann Arbor. I probably live in a landslide building, but I really don't know.
Why did you say city? Do you live in a landslide state?
No, I live in a swing state. I live in Michigan, and Michigan is 52-48. I don't even think it's that. Excuse me. I think it's 50-48 in the last election. So,
Sounds
go ahead.
Well, I think I was coyly trying to hint at. I think you're saying you live in a liberal city surrounded by conservative rural areas.
Mm.
Am I wildly off?
Oh no, it's certainly the case that in Michigan there are a number of liberal cities surrounded by rural areas. During the pandemic, if you were in many cities, you could tell just by mask wearing how things would change as soon as you crossed the city limit, going out or going in, for example. Which gas station you stopped at, for example. So,
really?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's so obvious; it's not remarkable.
Yeah, but I love these personal stories because I'm here in California, and again, my opinion doesn't matter. It's trying to get it from around the places. So you're in Michigan, and you're saying during COVID, you could see big differences of the people, not the elites, right? I'm imagining Mitch McConnell and AOC aren't hanging out there. These are regular Michiganders, right. And they are broken up into, hell no, you're not putting a mask on me, Fauci, or, oh my God, we all have to come together or we could die. And you literally saw that gas station to gas station.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember, but it's true everywhere. I remember once I was being driven around Columbus, Ohio, and it's a wonderful, pleasant, great city. But as I'm being driven around, people are kind of going, oh, that's the Republican neighborhood. That's a Democratic neighborhood. This is a Republican neighborhood. And I thought, this is wild. That I think is a city that's much more 50-50, but even then it's sort of balkanized by neighborhood, which I thought was interesting. But that is a product of our time. I'll leave it for people to reflect on it, and it's not a scientific insight, but
I know.
But it certainly is. But it certainly is notable. Even my hometown, which used to be Republican, is itself now Democratic, but it's surrounded by Republican County, which I think is interesting.
Was it like that before COVID?
It was like that up until it was Republican until I think the mid-2010s, and then it flipped Democratic.
When did you notice things getting this polarized? Was it during COVID was the first time? Or
in general, in the the concept or the phenomenon of the landslide county or the landslide district has been talked about for the past 20 years.
Right. But I'm just saying, in Michigan, when you notice this level of polarization during COVID, did you notice that same level of polarization before COVID? Like, did it happen? A lot of people say the moment Trump was elected, I noticed something. Some people say I didn't notice anything for a couple of years.
I don't think so. I think mask wearing, though, is sort of at the individual level. You can just notice something.
Okay.
And that is during the early days of COVID, where just sort of people, it was like the badge that people could wear or not. Are you going to wear a mask or not? And that made it fairly obvious. But it was quite. It was quite noticeable. And I'm a psychologist. I'm just interested in what's going on. And so it just became noticeable as soon as it started happening.
So is the reason we have polarization is the internet?
Well, everything is due to a number of factors that have to come together.
Okay.
So the internet might be the accelerant. I think there can be elite messaging that is also an accelerant. There can be a psychology of what people want to hear based on preferences, or a desire once your group shows a preference that you adopt because you want to be a member of your group. There are a number of factors that simply come together. And polarization, and then they begin to snowball as people stop focusing on policy and start focusing on the other group, especially when elite messaging starts to focus on the other group as the problem, as opposed to a policy issue being the problem.
I want to ask you about the psychology of what people want to hear, but I first want to ask you, I just got to ask, did we exist in a perfect state of nature and there were no problems, and then Donald Trump came and he alone caused polarization in America?
Oh,
the boogeyman theory. We were pretty cool, and then he came and he smashed it all by himself.
I'm going to say no, because there is no cause, or if he's a cause, every cause is a symptom of something else.
Thank you.
Yeah. If it hadn't been him, there would have been some other development that was caused by other stuff that was happening before.
Perfect answer. I'll get you that money after the show.
Oh, great.
I'm joking. We have no coordinate. I'm tongue in cheek about it, and I apologize, but I live out here in California, and we literally had lawyers, professors, politicians, everybody at all, top level, smartest people, the dumbest people going, oh yeah, Trump, that all him, racism, xenophobia, sexism started with him. These problems went away in the 90s, and then it was all perfect, and then Trump came and he made it all bad by himself. And I was like, that's exactly like that. Acts like there was no political problems before. There was no racial dog whistling in the Republican Party before. There was no xenophobia against immigrants in the Republican Party before. I know that's not true. I'm half Mexican. I know that's not true.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the 90s in California.
Right. Good times.
Yeah, and we can go back to Nixon, but I'm not a political historian.
I want to ask you about the psychology of what people want to hear. What does that mean?
Well, it is the case that we do try to be honest, but unfortunately, our thinking is contaminated by what we want to be true. The one phrase that has come out of psychology and permeated, infused other academic fields, and infused into popular culture. And I'm happy it's done so. In fact, I worry that it's done so too much, is the idea of motivated reasoning. That people are motivated to engage in wishful thinking, rationalization, self-deception, rose-colored glasses. Um, there is a tremendous catalog of strategies and moves we do that we engage so that we can self-deceive and believe things that we want to be true. Let's put it this way: the things that we want to be true, we give privileged status so that we can believe them to be true.
Right.
And the things we don't want to believe is true, well, we give them a hard time so that we can disbelieve them. And you mentioned it in your intro. I mean, we've done work that extends down even to the realm of vision. I mean, literally, you see what
I saw that.
and you don't see what you don't want to see.
That's insane.
Well,
Crazy we do that.
well, but once you start doing the work, you begin to realize, oh yeah, of course.
This is what it means to be human.
This is what it means to be human. This is what it means to have eyes.
You're biased. You're biased, folks. As much as you think you're not biased, you think you're not biased, you're biased.
Well, yes, you are biased, and you're biased in a way that you won't know that you're biased. I mean, the one thing to say is, and this is about your senses and your vision, is you don't see the world, physical world, the way it really is. But that's okay, because if you did, you would be dead. No, I'm serious. Your brain is an artist. It's painting a depiction of the world, but that's okay, because if it did, you would be dead.
Too hard to take the reality.
Well, no, it's here's one example. It takes your brain, let's say, 1/10 of a second to sort of compose the picture it's seeing. You are living in the past. And if I threw a baseball at your head, you would never catch it, because the baseball you would see, if it were the brain were telling you what it was really seeing, that's the baseball 1/10 of a second ago, you would miss it. So it projects the baseball ahead. So everything you see moving, your brain is projected 1/10 of a second ahead. So your brain is doing this sort of stuff all the time. And it's the basis for a lot of visual illusions, are really what your brain is doing in an evolutionarily favorable way. But your brain will play tricks on you. And and some of them have to do with your wishes. So one experiment we did is we showed people on a table some chocolates, wonderful, sweet smelling chocolates, except they were in a paper bag, or excuse me, a plastic bag. And we asked them to stand a certain ways away from them. And the way they stood indicated that they thought the chocolates were actually closer than they were. Well, your brain loved these chocolates, so they thought they were close. Or we took the chocolates and fashioned them like they were dog poop, and asked them to stand the same distance away. And people stood in such a way that indicated they thought the poop was actually farther away from them, because you don't want to be close to this thing. Now, the paradox is this really meant they were standing closer to the dog poop, because they thought the dog poop was further away. That's what their brain decided. But your brain is making these decisions based on desire, what it's seeing, all the time. It's constructing a depiction of the world. It's making choices based on ambiguous stimuli or data that it's getting from the world all the time. And it is influenced by your desires. Well, so are our thoughts. So is our reasoning.
Sure.
And this is happening all the time. So is our political beliefs. That's happening all the time as well.
I guess what I'm curious about is that going back to is it the elites or the people? I've heard a lot of people say, well, it's the elites that cause polarization. take a look at Donald Trump. He said all these dog whistling racist things, and then that sent cues, and we started seeing more people engaged in racism. But I've also heard a contrary theory. Donald Trump was a Democrat historically. He was hanging out with Hillary Clinton historically. So how did he get from this guy to that guy? Well, there's a period called the Tea Party during the presidency of Barack Obama. And they were talking about things like Obama's not a real American. He can't be a real American for various racist reasons, largely. And they held an event on Martin Luther King's birthday in Washington, D.C., where they kind of dog whistled racism again. Well, Donald Trump was hanging out with them, watching their tweets, gradually repeating it. He didn't start with the birther conspiracy. He watched them tweet it, and then he'd occasionally tweet out at it, saw the reaction, and then dug down into it. What that tells me is maybe he spit back racism is tolerable to the mass public, but he didn't get the idea. He got the idea from the public, which means the public gives cues to the elites, and maybe the cues give it back to the public.
Well,
is that possible when we look at the psychology of what people want to hear? People wanted to hear someone talking about racism is okay.
Well,
so
I think,
figure that out.
Yeah, I think it is the case that people do give the public what they want. So I'm not surprised about that. Wouldn't be surprised about that at all. That politicians can shape what the public thinks, but the public can certainly shape what politicians say. Absolutely. That they can reward politicians who say popular things. That is, if we watch politicians, we typically see they tend to trend toward agreeing with the public more than the public trends toward agreeing with politicians more. Both happen, but certainly politicians can trend toward where public favor lies. So that wouldn't surprise me at all.
We're we're winding down, unfortunately. You've been fascinating. I want to get to my last two. Oh no, I love it. I love it, especially when you said there are things coming out of the field of psychology that have been adopted by other disciplines, and you have some difference in how they're being interpreted. That's great, because that's barely talked about. Psychology, sociology, political psychology, political science are all looking at similar things, but in a little bit of research I've done, they're coming at it with a variety of different assumptions and background. And
absolutely.
Research. And so they're kind of occasionally overlapping, occasionally not overlapping. There seems to be a big difference between, I don't know, sociology, psychology, and political science on the role of the elites in the public and how it overplays. Like a lot of political scientists are, no, it's only the elites, period.
Yeah.
And that's, you get a different nuance with psychologists.
Well, psychologists, the sin of psychology is it tends to ignore the elites altogether. If any psychologists are watching this, they're probably going, "What do you mean?" And other psychologists are going, "Who are these elites?" But the elites do play a role. And I think psychologists are only beginning to recognize the important role that the elite environment plays in terms of the psychology of the common individual or the lay person.
I appreciate you saying that. Okay, last two questions. This is my favorite one. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this video. You watch the video, you go, wow, I learned a lot about psychology, other academic disciplines, how they're looking at this, how the human mind works, how it relates. But I'm struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing the professor said, and it's 5 days later after I watched the video. While I struggle to remember everything in the video, there's this one thought I just can't stop thinking about that this professor said. What is that one thought you would want someone to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after they watch this video?
Oh, it's something I haven't said yet, which is it's not in terms of motivated reasoning or in terms of polarization. It's not about how educated or how intelligent you are to be captured by this bug. It's about how emotionally you're caught up in your ideology or your partisanship. Um, being caught up is not about being uneducated or not being cognitively able. It's often portrayed that way, but it's not. It's helpful to be educated, it's helpful to be intelligent, but what really drives partisanship, at least in the data from our lab and other labs, is how emotionally invested, how emotionally caught up you are in partisanship, your party, or your ideology. That's the thing that matters. That's the thing you have to watch out for. So intelligence is not going to save you. It's taking a deep breath is going to save you. That's the thing that I would want people to remember. So that's the thing I finally said.
That's brilliant. I've heard that from a few other people, not that many. Just because you're educated and smart doesn't mean that you can't be biased either. And a lot of us are biased. And even the more, I've heard something that said, the more educated you get, the more likely you are to think that you can't be biased, which is even worse.
Yeah.
Because you can't.
Yeah, and there are some people who will say because you're intelligent, you will be more biased. I that's not my reading of the data that I see in the grand wash of social science. But it truly is the case that intelligence won't save you at all from a bias.
Right.
You really have to take a deep breath and ask, am I being impartial here? You really do.
I'm smart, I'm educated, therefore I must be right isn't good enough. You can be emotionally caught up.
That's right.
And it could be biasing your worldview.
That's right.
Any recommendations? You don't have to, but we always try to keep the conversation going. Do you know anybody? They could be an academic, they could be an activist, it could be someone you meet at the bar who can talk intelligently about this topic, have an honest conversation.
Oh, that's interesting. I would just recommend the British press.
Done.
Yeah, I'd recommend the BBC. I'd recommend the Guardian. I'd get out of the head of the United States.
I mostly get my American news from foreign sources.
Yeah, believe me. Yeah, that's the way to do it.
I already do that.
Yeah, the CBC. You get out of the States.
Yeah, I do a lot of French, India, Japanese, and British news. They have their own agendas, but it seems to be less overt when they're talking about America because it's not their own country. So they can be a little bit more free because they're, it's not their people per se.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll leave it there. I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. I really appreciate your time. I will email you a copy of the video shortly, and I want to say thank you for coming out, and I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right. I'll email you shortly, and thank you again, sir.
Take care.